Hey y'all, this is my second attempt at this video, so pardon me for having to use my work I've already worked through. I'm just going to talk y'all through it instead of redoing the entire thing, okay? So the first kind of problem that we have talked about this week would be just a regular old factor problem. And that is the first problem that you see here. How you work through this is you ask yourself, what numbers can you multiply together to get a positive 6? Well, 1 and 6, 2 and 3. All right, now this question is a little bit tricky because it has multiple options that could be considered correct if you don't think about it completely, okay? So you can get a negative 5 using the numbers 2 and 3 and 1 and 6, but you've got to remember that the factors you choose, not only do they have to add together to be negative 5, but they have to multiply together to be positive 6. And the only way that happens if you have a negative 2 and a negative 3. So that is what we have to use. X minus 2 and x minus 3. When you factor, you're just undoing the rainbows, undoing the distributive process, and that's how that works out, okay? On the second question, it says to factor and solve. Before you can solve, before you can factor, you have to make sure this is in standard form. And that just means that your square term is first, your middle term is your x term, your last term is a constant, which means it's a regular number, and it's equal to 0. That's very important. This one is in standard form, so we can go ahead and factor it. So we look at the factors of 18, and 1 and 18, 2 and 9, negative 3 and 6 work. Now, the reason we need to choose negative 3 and 6 is because when we multiply these, we do need to get a negative 18. So that means one of them has to be negative. But then when we add them, we want a positive 3. So that's why we need x minus 3 and x plus 6. So always double check to make sure that both of those two things check out. Negative 3 plus 6 is positive 3. Negative times 6 is a negative 18. Once you factor it, just like we did on this first problem, this has an additional step. It says to solve. That means we take each of these factors and we set them equal to 0, and we solve it for x. So we've got two little baby equations. One of them says x minus 3 equals 0. Add 3 on both sides, you get 3. The other one is x plus 6 equals 0. Subtract 6 on both sides, you get negative 6. And we like to represent our answers in a little solution set with braces. So 3, negative 6 is your answer on that one. Okay? That's factor and solve. All right, got one more factor and solve question for you. It is here. All right, now this problem is different because it is not a standard form. It is not equal to 0. This is equal to 8x, so we need to adjust that. If you want to move 8x over here, and the reason I want to do that is because my x squared is positive. We need that middle term here to be in standard form, and we need it to be equal to 0. If this is a positive 8x, to get it to this side of the equation, we need to undo it technically, so that's minus 8x on both sides. Now, when you're doing that on the right-hand side, you're going to get a 0. But on the left-hand side, what do you subtract it from? You don't really have anything to subtract it from because there's no like terms over there. So what you're going to do is just write it in standard form by putting it as the middle term. Now we're equal to 0. And now we can treat it like we did these first two questions. So what are the factors of 7? 1 and 7. Not many choices on that. If we're going to multiply these factors to get a positive 7, yet add them to get a negative 8, then we have to have negative 1 and negative 7. That's the only way we can make that work. So that would be our factoring for that one. Then to set each one of those equal to 0, again, two little baby equations here. It's x minus 1 equals 0. Add 1 on both sides, you get 1. X minus 7 equals 0. Add 7 on both sides, you get 7. So here is your solution set for that. All right. This is for sums 7 and 8. This next question is starting the next assignment So I suppose I'll call that number 9. Alrighty. This is a different kind of problem because, well, there's a number in front of this squared term that is not 1. Notice on all of these other questions, they're just 1s. This one is a 2. And it's not like a question where we could just divide every term by 2 and then factor it. That won't work because 5 divided by 2 is ugly. So we don't want to do that. So we have to do a method on this one called splitting the middle term. And the middle term is 5x. How you start one of these questions is you multiply this coefficient on x squared by this constant at the end, which is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. And then you think about the factors of that. So that would be 1 and 4, 2 and 2. Now I've already boxed in 1 and 4 because 1 times 4 is 4 and 1 plus 4 is my middle term. So you're using the same kind of thinking in that area as you are on these others, but here's where the things are going to get different. We are splitting the middle term. So we split the middle term up with those factors that you chose. Yes, it does matter which ones you choose. They still have to add or subtract to be your middle term. So we couldn't choose 2 and 2 because that would be 4x, and that's not what we're trying to do. So we split this up using 1x and 4x. 1x and 4x. From this point, what we're going to do is divide the problem in half. So I've divided it in half here between the 4x and the 1x. And we're going to think about what's the greatest common factor of this half and this half. Now for your first half, the number that divides into 2 and 4 is 2. And since this is x squared and this is just x, I can factor out an x because they both have 1. Your greatest common factor goes outside your parentheses. And you got to figure out what's left over from that. So what's going to be left over from that? What happens if you divide that greatest common factor by your terms? So 2 divided by 2 is gone. That's a 1. X squared divided by x is just x. Same thing here. Plus 4 divided by 2 is 2. And x divided by x, well, that's gone. So you've got 2x outside of x plus 2. All right, whatever this sign is, bring it down. It's a plus. What's the greatest common factor of 1x and 2? Same thing. So the only thing that I can divide into both of these numbers is 1. So I put that outside my parentheses. What happens if I divide it out? Well, 1 divided by 1 is 1, and then x is still there. 2 divided by 1 is just 2. So there's that. Now what you notice down here is that in parentheses, I have x plus 2 on this half. I also have x plus 2 on this half. That means that is one of my factors for my answer is x plus 2. The stuff that is left over, or the outside, the greatest common factors, those together form the second factor. So your answer in factor form for this trinomial is x plus 2 and 2x plus 1. All right, I've got another one. I think I'm actually going to just write it out and redo it so y'all can see me work it out completely. So it's 3x squared plus 17x minus 6. What you want to do is multiply the number on x squared by the very last number. So 3 times negative 6 is going to be negative 18. And I want to look at the factors of negative 18. So 1, 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. Which one of these combinations is going to give us a 17 if we add them or subtract them? Not these two, this one right here. To get a positive 17 out of those two numbers, we need to have one of them be a negative, and it needs to be the number 1. And then when you multiply those, you're still going to get a negative 18, so that's good. So we're going to split this middle term up into those two factors and put x's on them. So let's make it negative 1x plus 18x. Bring down your first term, and then bring down that last term. When you're splitting the middle term, that's when you do it. You split that middle term up into those factors, and then it's a different process from there. So what number divides into 3 and 1? The highest one would be 1. So 1 for that. This has x squared. This term has an x, so we can factor out x from both terms. Now, what's left over after we do that? Well, what you can do is think about dividing that out, and that'll help a little bit. So 3 divided by 1 is 3. So I've still got 3 there, and I'm still going to have an x on this term. Minus 1 divided by 1 is 1. And then x divided by x, well, that's gone. So that's what we have for the first half. Do the same thing on the second half. Whatever this sign is, bring it down. What's the highest number that goes into 18 and 6? Well, the highest number I can think of that divides into both is 6. That's the greatest common factor of both. So we're going to factor that out of this half. 18 divided by 6 is 3. And then our x will stay on that term. We couldn't take it out because both of these don't have an x. And then negative 6 divided by 6 is negative 1. So you see right here, again, we've got the same stuff in each of these sets of parentheses. So 3x minus 1 is your first factor. The stuff that you used for the greatest common factor on the outside of those parentheses is your other factor. I call them the leftovers. And that's how you would factor by splitting the middle term.